Have you ever been chosen for something that seemed bigger than you? Something that at the moment felt like an honor, but also came with an enormous weight of responsibility. This is the story of Igal, a man hand-picked by Moses for a mission that could transform the future of all the people of Israel. He was not just another face in the crowd, he was a leader, a trusted and prominent figure. Igal's task was to represent his tribe, Issachar, in one of the most important journeys of his time, exploring the land of Canaan, the land promised by God. But while this mission was a unique opportunity, it also brought significant challenges. After all, he wasn't going as a simple traveler, but as the eyes and ears of an entire people who anxiously and faithfully awaited the good news. This is a story of courage, choices, and above all, faith, or the lack of it. Now I invite you to delve into this narrative that still teaches us so much about responsibility, trust in God, and the consequences of our decisions. Imagine the Israelite camp in the desert. Thousands of tents scattered, the people restless, eager to know when they would finally inherit the land that God had promised them. Moses, guided by the Lord, calls leaders from each tribe for a special mission. Among those summoned is Igal, the representative of the tribe of Issachar. This call is not casual. Being chosen as a spy is a sign of trust and leadership. Only men of influence and respect were selected for this task. This leads us to reflect. Why was Igal chosen? Perhaps he was known for his wisdom or his ability to assess critical situations. Or perhaps he was someone with a strong voice within his tribe, someone whose words were listened to attentively. Either way, at that moment, Igal stood out as one of the 12 who would have the privilege and the responsibility of spying on the land of Canaan. The journey begins. Picture the scene. 12 men crossing the desert toward the promised land. They walk under the scorching sun with few shadows to rest. Every step is a mix of expectation and tension. Finally, they reach the borders of Canaan. What they see at first glance is impressive. The land is fertile, full of vines and fields. The fruits are large and ripe, almost as if visually confirming God's promise. But at the same time, they notice something that unsettles them. The cities are fortified, and the inhabitants are giants, strong and well-armed. This duality, a land full of blessings but also challenges, begins to shape the perception of each spy. And here's an important lesson. When God calls us to something, the path is often difficult, but the rewards are worth it. During the 40 days of exploration, Igal sees the riches of the land, but also the challenges it presents. He witnesses the extraordinary fruits, like the famous cluster of grapes so large it has to be carried by 2 men. But instead of focusing on God's promises, Igal begins to focus on the obstacles. The giants intimidate him, and the fortified cities seem invincible. He shares his concerns with the other spies, and this pessimism starts to spread. How many times do we do the same? God shows us a path, but we let fear and difficulties make us doubt. When the spies return to the Israelite camp, the whole congregation gathers to hear their words. Picture the scene. Thousands of people eagerly waiting, hungry for good news. The key spies begin describing the riches of the land and the people cheer. But suddenly the tone changes. Igal and the other 10 spies declare, "The land is good, but the inhabitants are powerful, and their cities are fortified. We cannot defeat them. We look like grasshoppers compared to them." This declaration demotivates the people. Murmurs spread through the camp. Fear grows, and faith in God diminishes. Only Joshua and Caleb have a different vision. They try to encourage the people, saying, "If the Lord is pleased with us, he will give us this land." But Igal's words, and those of the other spies, have already planted the seed of doubt. Igal and his companions' negative report not only demotivates the people, but it also sparks a rebellion. They begin questioning Moses and Aaron, and many even ask to return to Egypt. This moment is a turning point for Israel. Seeing the people's unbelief, God declares that that generation will not enter the promised land. They will wander in the desert for 40 years, until all those who doubted, including Igal, die in the desert. Here's a hard but necessary lesson. The lack of faith and trust in God can have profound consequences, not only for us, but for those around us. Have you ever been so close to something great, but felt that fear tried to stop you from moving forward? When Igal and the other spies finally arrive in the land of Canaan, their eyes fill with wonder. They see fertile land, green hills, and abundant crops. The fruits are large and juicy, just as God had promised. Imagine the impact of this vision, the fulfillment of a long-awaited dream, a land that symbolizes hope and freedom after years of slavery in Egypt. But it doesn't take long for the initial admiration to be replaced by unease. As they explore, they notice the fortified cities, the high walls, and the imposing warriors who inhabit the land. Igal observes everything carefully, but in his heart begins to sprout a thought. How can we conquer this place? The tension builds. The spies are on a divine mission, but the pressure of returning with a clear and trustworthy report for Moses and the people starts to weigh on them. During the 40 days spent in the land, Igal and the others collect evidence of Canaan's riches. They cut a bunch of grapes so large it has to be carried by 2 men on a pole. They also gather pomegranates and figs as proof of the land's fertility. However, while they celebrate the abundance, they encounter something that terrifies them. The Anakim, a race of giants who inhabit the land. For Igal, the sight of these enormous men is enough to fuel his fear. They are much stronger than we are, he thinks. How can we fight against such a people? Meanwhile, Caleb and Joshua see the same thing, but have a different perspective. To them, the giants are just another obstacle that God will overcome. It's a matter of faith versus fear. How many times in our lives do we see challenges larger than our resources and forget that God is bigger than any giant? In the last week of exploration, the group begins to debate what they will say upon returning. Caleb insists, "We need to encourage the people. This land is exactly as God promised, and with him, we can conquer it." But Igal, along with the other spies, disagrees. "Didn't you see the size of the warriors? They will crush us like insects. We cannot lead the people into certain defeat." The arguments continue. The division among the spies is clear. On one side, there is the vision of faith and courage represented by Joshua and Caleb. On the other, there is the vision of fear and doubt, led by Igal and the others. This scene is a reflection of our own internal battles. When facing challenges, we are often tempted to give more weight to the difficulties than to the promises of God. When the group returns to the camp, all the people of Israel gather to hear the news. It's a moment of expectation. The people are tired of the desert and eager to enter the promised land. Igal begins by describing the abundance of the land. He shows the fruits gathered as proof of the land's fertility. But then his tone changes. He speaks of the fortified cities, the powerful warriors, and the giants. "We cannot conquer this land. They are stronger than we are." The impact of his words is devastating. Murmurs of fear begin to spread among the people. Some ask, "Why did God bring us here to die?" Caleb tries to intervene. "We must not fear. God is with us and will give us the victory." But the pessimistic report from Igal and the others has already poisoned the hearts. Fear spreads like wildfire. The doubt generated by Igal's report does not only affect the present moment, it defines the fate of an entire generation. God, seeing the disbelief of the people, declares that they will not enter the promised land. For 40 years they will wander in the desert until all the adults of that generation, including Igal, die. For Igal, this is a bitter lesson. He had the privilege of seeing with his own eyes the promised land, but his lack of faith prevented him from enjoying it. He chose to focus on the obstacles instead of God's promises, and that choice came at a high cost. Now, I ask you, in which areas of your life are you allowing fear to speak louder than faith? Have you ever made a decision that changed everything, not just for you but for everyone around you? When Igal presents his report on Canaan, he doesn't realize that his words carry more weight than he imagines. The pessimistic view he shares is not just an opinion, but a sentence that affects the entire congregation of Israel. The camp, which was once full of hope and expectation, is now dominated by fear. The people begin to question Moses, God's promise, and even their journey from Egypt. Why did the Lord bring us here to die by the hands of our enemies? They cry. Igal unknowingly ignites the flame of rebellion. He and the other fearful spies allow their unbelief to spread like poison. And here's a hard truth. Our words and actions have the power to influence, for better or for worse, the lives of those around us. Joshua and Caleb cannot remain silent. They rise up against the fear that dominates the crowd. Caleb boldly declares, "We should not fear. The land is good, and if the Lord is pleased with us, he will give us the victory." But the voices of Joshua and Caleb are drowned out by the clamor of the people. Igal and the other spies continue to insist. "We cannot face them. They are stronger than us." This division between faith and fear reflects a battle we all face. When we face challenges, which voice do we choose to hear? The voice of courage, or that of fear? The people, however, choose to believe Igal's report. They begin to murmur against Moses and Aaron, questioning their leadership, and even suggesting a return to Egypt. The people's cry turns into rebellion. They go so far as to plan choosing a new leader to guide them back to Egypt. Moses and Aaron fall to the ground in an act of desperation and intercession. At that moment, the glory of the Lord appears in the tent of meeting. God, seeing the unbelief and rebellion of the people, speaks to Moses. "How long will this people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, despite all the signs I performed among them?" God's declaration is heavy. He is ready to destroy the people and start over with Moses, but Moses intercedes, asking for mercy. He reminds God of his promise and how the neighboring nations would view the destruction of Israel as a divine failure. God hears Moses' plea and decides to spare the people, but with a severe condition. That generation who doubted will not enter the promised land. Only Joshua and Caleb, who trusted the Lord, will see the promise fulfilled. For Igal, God's sentence is a deep blow. He was chosen for a special mission, had the privilege of seeing the promised land, but allowed fear to overshadow his faith. Now he knows he will never enter Canaan. As the people hear God's decision, a silence takes over the camp. Many cry in repentance, but the damage is already done. They will spend the rest of their lives wandering the desert, knowing that their children will carry the weight of their decisions. Igal reflects on his choices. He who began this journey as a respected leader is now remembered as someone who failed to trust the God who parted the Red Sea and led Israel with fire and cloud. This scene makes us think, how many times have we let fear and doubt prevent us from moving forward, even after witnessing God's faithfulness? Igal's story does not end just as a tale of failure, but as a lesson for future generations. He teaches us the cost of unbelief and the importance of trusting in God, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. As Igal and his generation face the reality of their consequences, the message is clear. Trusting in God is not an option. It is a necessity. His promises are faithful, but it is up to us to choose to believe in them. Now I ask, what are the giants you have been facing? And have you let fear dominate your decisions? Have you ever faced the consequences of a wrong choice, knowing there's no way to go back? After God's declaration, a deep silence falls over the camp. The people of Israel, who had hoped to march triumphantly into Canaan, now face the harsh reality. They will wander in the desert until that entire unbelieving generation has passed. The desert, which had once been just a path to the promise, becomes a place of judgment and learning. Igal is among those who feel the weight of this sentence. He who saw the promised land, who walked among the abundant fruits and fertile fields, now knows he will never enjoy these blessings. He tries to continue with his responsibilities, but the gaze of the other spies, especially Joshua and Caleb, is a constant reminder of his failure. The desert, often described as a place of scarcity, becomes a mirror of Israel's choices. Each grain of sand seems to carry the message, trust in God. Life in the desert is harsh. Water and food are scarce, and the people rely entirely on the manna God sends daily. This manna, though sufficient to sustain the body, is also a reminder of their total dependence on the Lord. Igal walks among the people and hears their complaints. Why didn't we stay in Egypt? There at least we had meat, onions, and melons. He feels the despair in their words, but also notices something deeper. The people still haven't learned to trust. They continue to murmur, wishing to return to what they knew. even if it was a life of slavery. In his heart, Igal struggles with his own feelings. He begins to realize that his unbelief wasn't just a strategic mistake, but a lack of faith in God's promises. However, pride prevents him from admitting it openly. How many times do we ourselves struggle to admit our mistakes, even when the consequences are before us? While the people murmur and lament, Joshua and Caleb remain steadfast in their faith. They know that one day they will enter the promised land, but they also understand that this will happen after a long wait. Caleb, in particular, is an inspiration to many, even to Igal, though he never admits it. He observes how Caleb encourages others, even in the harshness of the desert. "The Lord is faithful," Caleb often says. "If he promised, he will fulfill it." Joshua, on the other hand, focuses on serving Moses, learning the leadership he will one day need to exercise. His faithfulness is unwavering, and he keeps his eyes fixed on God's promise. Igal, seeing these two men, begins to wonder, "Why didn't I have that faith? Where did I go wrong?" But he still can't find the right words to deal with his guilt. This scene reminds us that, even in the midst of difficulties, there are always those who choose to trust and persevere. One night, as the camp sleeps, Igal steps away to a quiet place in the desert. He looks at the starry sky, and his mind goes back to Canaan. He remembers the sweet taste of the grapes, the fragrance of the pomegranates, and the sight of the fertile fields. But above all, he remembers the giants and the fear he felt. "I let fear win," he murmurs to himself. He remembers how Caleb's words sounded that day. "We should not fear. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will give us this land." Igal realizes that his failure wasn't just strategic, it was spiritual. He allowed fear to cloud his vision of God's faithfulness. He begins to understand that God's promise didn't depend on the strength of the people of Israel, but on the strength of God himself. This reflection is a turning point in Igal's journey. Though he knows he will never enter Canaan, he begins to seek ways to redeem his faith and encourage others not to make the same mistakes. As the years pass and the unbelieving generation begins to fade, a new generation arises. They hear the stories of Canaan, of the giants and the fortified cities, but also of God's miracles in the desert. Igal, now older and wiser, begins to share his experiences with the young people. He talks about the privilege of having seen the promised land and the weight of his choices. "Do not make the same mistake we did," he says. "Trust in the Lord, even when everything seems impossible." His testimonies do not erase the consequences of his choices, but they help prepare the next generation to face challenges with faith and courage. The desert is not just a place of judgment. It is also a place of learning and preparation. God uses this time to shape the character of the people of Israel, to teach them that his promises are true and that faith is the key to conquering them. Have you ever noticed how even the most painful mistakes can teach valuable lessons to those who come after us? The years have passed, and now Igal is one of the elders of Israel, living the final days of his journey in the desert. He has become a figure who carries both the weight of his mistake and the wisdom of the lessons learned. Igal begins to gather the young people around a fire, sharing his experience as a spy. He speaks with passion and honesty, not hiding his failures. "I was chosen for a mission that could have changed the history of our people. I saw the promised land with my own eyes. It is everything God said it would be. But I chose to fear what I saw, instead of trusting the God who freed us from Egypt." The young people listen attentively. For them, Igal's words are a reminder that faith is stronger than fear. He continues, "You who will enter the land, remember this. God doesn't call us to look at circumstances with human eyes, but with spiritual eyes. Trust in him, and he will do great things through you." This scene shows us the impact of a sincere testimony. Even though Igal never enters Canaan, he finds purpose in preparing the new generation to inherit God's promise. As the years pass, the new generation grows up hearing the stories of the Exodus, the Red Sea, and the manna that falls from the sky. They hear about Canaan, but also about the unbelief of their parents. These stories shape their view of God and strengthen their faith. Joshua and Caleb continue to lead. inspiring the people with their faithfulness. They constantly remind, "The Lord is with us. There is no enemy too great that he cannot defeat." Igal observes this transition of leadership with a mix of regret and hope. He sees in Joshua and Caleb the leaders he could have been if he had trusted more in God. But instead of sinking into sadness, he chooses to be a voice of support, an encourager in the background. "What God began with us, he will complete through you," he often says. This scene teaches us that even when we fail, we can still contribute to God's plan, as long as we are willing to learn and teach. When the journey in the desert is coming to an end, Igal, now weak and tired, is taken by some young people to a hill that offers a distant view of the promised land. He watches the fertile hills and the green valleys of Canaan. Tears stream down his face. He knows he will never set foot on that land, but at that moment he perceives something deeper. God's promise is greater than his own failures. "God's faithfulness doesn't depend on my faithfulness," he murmurs. "He is faithful because that is his nature." The young people around him are touched by his words. They see in Igal not just a man who failed, but someone who found redemption by recognizing God's greatness. How many of us need that reminder? That even when we fail, God remains faithful. In the final days of his life, Igal makes a point to leave a clear message for the people. He gathers the families and says, "Don't forget what happened to us in the desert. Unbelief kept us from the promise, but you can choose to trust. Don't let fear steal what God has prepared for you." He looks at the leaders of the new generation and affirms, "When you face fortified cities and giants, remember that the Lord is with you. Don't repeat our mistake." This scene is a powerful reminder of how the past can teach us to live better in the present. Even in moments when we fail, we can still contribute to God's greater plan, encouraging others to move forward in faith. Igal's story ends in the desert, but the impact of his choices and testimony remains. He teaches us that fear can distance us from God's promises, but there is also redemption in honesty and learning. Now, I want to ask you, what challenges have been preventing you from trusting God completely? Are you letting fear speak louder than faith? Leave a comment here on how this story impacted you. And if you believe these messages can help others, subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends and family. Don't forget to like, comment, and turn on notifications to continue following stories that transform lives. Here, we share stories that show how faith can overcome any challenge, and there's much more to come. May God bless your life and your family, and see you in the next video.